Sentinel Island Missionary. There are some rare areas of the world where groups of people live in complete isolation. These tribes refuse to have contact with the outside world and are ready to attack outsiders who try to change that. Despite that, there was one man who was determined to meet such a tribe. John Allen Chow grew up in Washington and was always described as an adventurous kid. He would spend most of his time in nature with his friends or family, mostly hiking and exploring new areas. Despite his lively spirit, he struggled with finding his own identity. As a result, he joined a Christian school mission trip to Mexico when he was still in school. This trip inspired a passion for Christian missions that would stay with him for life. He also wanted to spread his Christian beliefs across the globe. His heroes were not people like Michael Jackson, but famous missionaries David Livingstone or Jim Elliot. John respected these men and wanted to be like them. Jim Elliot was especially a role model for him because the man had tried to preach to an uncontacted tribe in Ecuador and was killed for it. John was deeply inspired by Jim's total dedication to the cause and also dreamed of meeting an uncontacted tribe. After many different missions, John finally found the destination of his dream. North Sentinel Island, located near the Andaman Islands in India. There, the Sentinelese live as one of the few uncontacted tribes in the world, but not because there weren't any chances for it. For more than 200 years, they rejected any offer from the outside world and are known to violently protect their territory. The only time they ever came in contact with outsiders was when a group of British explorers took some of them with them to England. However, since their immune system was not used to the outside world, they died within days. What is a normal cold to us was basically a death sentence to them. I imagine this history also didn't add to their opinion of outsiders. Another contact occurred when fishermen got stranded on their island. This ended with them getting speared to death on the shore. As a result, the Indian government made it illegal to enter the island and declared that the Sentinelese should be left alone. Armed boats patrol the area to ensure this, both to protect the Sentinelese and outsiders who underestimate the risk. Despite that, John was determined to contact this tribe. Inspired by the Christian organization All Nations, he believed that the Sentinelese must become Christians to be connected to the rest of the world. He actually believed that they were the last Satan stronghold on earth, since they were lacking any knowledge about God and Christianity. John was obsessed with this tribe and believed that it was his calling to save their eternal souls. He only told All Nations about his plans because he was afraid his family would talk him out of it. As a result, in 2018, he began a long preparation phase during which he got all necessary vaccines and took linguistic lessons. He then journeyed to Port Blair, near Sentinel Island. There, John entered a quarantine to protect the Sentinelese from any disease he could bring with him. Finally, on November 25th, it was time for action. John bribed 5 local fishermen to bring him as close as possible to the island. At first, they refused, but eventually agreed to bring him 1,600 feet away from the shore. These fishermen obviously knew about the aforementioned men that had been killed on the island and didn't want to get any closer. Furthermore, they once again advised John not to go through with his plan. But there was no way to stop this man, especially not after coming that far. He got into a canoe and made his way to the island, where he was immediately greeted by members of the tribe. And by greeted, I mean that they were aiming their bows at him. John tried to offer them some gifts and told them, quote, "My name is John, I love you, and Jesus loves you. They just respond by stringing their bows, and John returns back to the fishermen, at least for now. From now on, he would go there every day and try to establish contact with the tribe. After a few days, John had become a kind of attraction for the tribe, and people would gather to laugh at him. John would then try to mimic their language, but they would only answer with more laughter. It is assumed that they had purposefully called him bad words and were amused when the outsider tried to repeat them. It's honestly kind of wholesome to see that even an uncontacted tribe has the same humor as any other human on the planet. But not all of these encounters ended in laughter. In his journal, John described an incident where he once again tried to talk to the Sentinelese. Then a young boy decided to shoot a metal-pointed arrow at John. This arrow would have pierced his heart if John didn't happen to hold his Bible in front of his chest. John just pulled the arrow out of the Bible and gave it back to the boy. However, he did retreat to the fisher boat because he was afraid that the tribe might kill him that day. This incident actually triggered doubt in John, and he wrote in his journal that he played with the idea of abandoning his mission. After all, he was just inches away from dying that day. But John kept talking himself into staying, and came up with various reasons. One of those was that he had lost his passport and convinced himself that he couldn't return home anyway. Additionally, he believed that if he would leave, he would abandon both his mission and the tribe's souls. Considering how obsessed he was with the idea of converging this tribe, this was not an option for John. One entry in the journal read, "I think it is worthwhile to declare Jesus to these people. Please do not get angry at them, or God if I get killed. Don't retrieve my body." Following this journal entry, John ordered the fishermen to leave him alone at the island. He theorized that the Sentinelese may have been hostile towards him because they saw the boats looming in the distance. So if the boats were gone, he would be more likely to succeed in his mission. At least that's the idea he had come up with. It isn't known what exactly transpired on the North Sentinel Island, but when the fishermen returned the next day, they witnessed something horrible. Members of the tribe were dragging John's corpse across the beach. His body was left there for an entire day before he was actually buried by the tribe. At this point, the fishermen went to the police and were all arrested for helping John to reach the island illegally. All Nations was later criticized for knowing about his plan and not stopping him from actually executing it. John's father claimed that they were extremists who basically brainwashed his son into going on a lethal mission. And there is definitely merit to this argument. Part of the All Nations training is a fake scenario where a new missionary is blindfolded and brought face to face with an uncontacted tribe. If the new recruit would fail to properly communicate with these actors, they would stab him with fake spears, an eerie training that would foreshadow John's later demise. In the end, we are left with the story of a young man who just wanted to spread love. But by ignoring all dangers and entering a restricted area, he ultimately lost his life. Scrap metal. For our next story, we travel to Estonia, a country in northern Europe. Inside the small village of Tamiku lived a middle-aged man named Ivan. Back in 1994, Ivan was relatively poor, and at some point he began to steal scrap metal, which he would then later sell to support his family. Besides his new hobby of stealing scraps, Ivan would spend much of his time in the nearby woods to either collect firewood or just to enjoy nature. During one of these trips, he struggled with finding suitable firewood and ventured further into the woods than ever before. He came across something strange, something that didn't match the untouched nature around it at all. He was standing in front of an old chain-link fence, and behind that fence he spotted a building. This old multi-story building looked like an abandoned government facility, but Ivan had no idea why it was standing there. However, due to his intrigue, he got closer to the fence and took a closer look at this strange building. It was located several hundred feet behind the fence, and no one else seemed to be around. Additionally, there was graffiti on the walls, and all the doors and windows were boarded up, a clear indicator that this old facility must be abandoned. When Ivan realized this, his mind immediately wandered to scrap metals. He assumed that if that was really a government facility, it might house a large quantity of different metals he could then sell. Ivan then spent the rest of the day watching the building and making sure that the facility really was unsupervised. When he was convinced, he ran back to his hometown and informed his two brothers of this new discovery. They were very excited, and the group of men made their way to this old building. Around midnight, they arrived back at the property and climbed over the fence. Every step they made towards this building confirmed their assumption that this place must be abandoned. There was just one problem. Apparently, the building was barricaded in a way that made it impossible to simply break in. Despite that, they began to hit the barricades and tried everything in their power to get inside this facility. But it was of no use. At some point, they decided that it would be dangerous to stay there for a prolonged period of time and agreed to head back. However, while walking towards the fence, one of them spotted a small fence further to the right. Of course, this wasn't their original plan, but since they had already made the trip, they might as well take any scrap metal they could find in there. In contrast to the main building, this small shed was only secured with a simple padlock. Not much of a challenge for three men eager to explore the facility, especially not for their bolt cutters. At first, they were rather disappointed by what they had found. The shed was mostly empty, and they already got comfortable with the idea of heading back home with empty hands. But then, one of the brothers moved something and discovered a more or less hidden staircase. They assumed that this staircase would lead them to an underground bunker, which is not only interesting, but could provide some special items. And while there was some hesitation, they slowly checked out the staircase, and upon seeing no visible threats, they did decide to go down there. Like true adventurers, they began to explore a gigantic basement filled with all kinds of scrap metals and other goodies. Scrap metal everywhere on the ground, large metal shelves, various metal briefcases or boxes, and finally several 55-gallon aluminum barrels. It was basically heaven for anyone interested in scrap metal. Especially these barrels would be extremely valuable, at least if they were empty and therefore movable. They opted for the scientific approach and just hit one of the barrels. The way this barrel moved convinced them that these barrels were indeed empty. They had struck gold. The brothers eagerly rolled the first barrel back to the base of the stairs and instantly went back for more. But this time, something went wrong. You see, when they checked the barrels, they didn't check all of them thoroughly. So when they tried to pull the next one off the shelf, it crashed into another barrel, this time a fully filled 500-pound barrel. And if that wasn't enough, this barrel landed directly on Ivan's legs, pinning him to the ground. Even after his brothers freed him, it was clear that his legs had sustained from serious damage. At this point, it became clear that they wouldn't be able to transport both the wounded Ivan as well as the barrels back home. Finally, they came to the conclusion that it would be wiser to bring Ivan back home and to wait for his recovery. They could still return to this place and loot it for all its valuables. However, before leaving, they picked up all the metal they could carry. The three of them then made their way back to the fence and somehow managed to get over it. They made their way through the forest and finally reached Tamiku. Back home, they laid Ivan down in his bed and let him rest for the night, expecting that he would feel a lot better in the morning. When Ivan woke up, his leg didn't feel any better. In fact, it felt like it was burning from the inside. Ivan waited for 3 days, but the pain grew worse with every passing day. Finally, he decided that he immediately needed to see a doctor and went to the hospital. There, they obviously asked him how he had injured his leg, and Ivan only told them that a tree had fallen onto it since he didn't want to admit to doing something illegal. Besides, since the barrel had actually crushed his leg, this fake story wouldn't change anything about how the doctors would treat him. And he was right. From a medical perspective, his injuries could be the result of a tree crushing his leg, and so the doctors began to treat him. But for some reason, all the usual stuff they would do for a crush injury showed no effect. For about 8 days, Ivan complained about his pain becoming worse. Furthermore, his leg swelled more, and all his vital functions began to deteriorate. About 10 days after the accident had happened, he was found dead inside his hospital room. His kidneys had failed, which made no sense given the nature of his injury. Of course, everyone was confused by this, and neither the doctors nor the family could wrap their head around how a crush injury could lead to kidney failure. And this is where things became weird. Shortly after Ivan's death, the beloved family dog also died, again with no apparent reason and despite having been healthy until 2 weeks ago. Following this incident, Ivan's stepson began to feel sick as well, and one day showed up with terrible injuries to his hand. His hands were covered in terrible blisters, and it almost looked like he had put his hands in a campfire. So the family once again went to the hospital. And again, neither the son nor the doctors understood what was happening. He only told them that he had used some of Ivan's tools and had gone through his belongings. Since the medical staff had witnessed Ivan's weird death and were also informed of the dog's death, they had a terrible theory. The hospital contacted authorities, who then went to the family home. They showed up in hazard suits and evacuated the family immediately. Their equipment led them to Ivan's toolbox and one particular item. One relatively small piece of scrap metal that Ivan had grabbed when they investigated this strange bunker. As it turns out, this piece of scrap metal was really lethal. The old building they had found was an abandoned nuclear waste storage facility, and the piece of metal was highly radioactive. It was revealed that while Ivan and his brothers had checked out the property for any surveillance and stuff like this, they never bothered to check out the front gate, which was plastered with signs warning trespassers of radioactive waste. As you can imagine, these weird briefcases I mentioned earlier were containers securing this material. When they dropped the barrel, one of these containers was broken alongside Ivan's legs and Ivan then picked up the radioactive metal. He then made the lethal mistake of putting this material in his pocket, where it had more or less direct contact to his body. The brothers didn't realize at the time, but when they pushed down this barrel, they triggered a chain reaction that inevitably led to Ivan's death. Once you are hit with that level of radiation, nothing can save you. Even if the doctors would have realized what was happening to Ivan, there would have been no way to cure him. The moment he picked up this piece of metal, his death was only a matter of time. In a similar manner, their family dog had died because it slept on Ivan's jacket while the piece of metal was still inside it. And the son sustained such massive injuries after moving it very briefly. Luckily, both this stepson and his brothers managed to completely recover. But Ivan remains the victim of entering a forbidden property and deciding to pick up the one thing that could kill him. The boilers. In 2007, Wade Steffey was studying at Purdue University, located in Indiana. The young aviation technology student had just returned to the first week of the year's spring semester. On January 12th, he entered one of the dining halls and joined thousands of other students, all still excited for the new semester. About an hour later, Wade said goodbye to his friends and left the dining hall. He then went to one of the dormitories to visit some of his friends. There he joined them and drank some alcohol for about an hour. At some point, they decided to head to a nearby frat party, and Wade stayed there until about midnight. Around this time, he remembered that he had left his jacket back in the dormitory. This was a problem, because the dorms all close at a certain time, and can only be entered if you have a key card, or if you know someone inside. Since Owen Hall, the dormitory where he met his friends, was not his own dormitory, Wade excused himself and went back to campus, hoping to reach someone inside Owen Hall to open the door to him. On his way back to campus, he made 6 calls to people who he thought lived in this dormitory. In reality, only 2 of those 6 were residents of Owen Hall, and those 2 didn't pick up the phone. So when he arrived at Owen Hall, he had no choice but to knock at the door. However, the only person who heard this decided to deny entry to Wade since he seemed very intoxicated. Realizing that there was no way to successfully enter Owen Hall, Wade turned around and left the scene. It was only 4 days later, when Wade's roommate returned to their dorm, that he noticed that Wade was not in the dorm. He tried to call Wade, asked other residents of the dorm, and even called Wade's family to find out if they had seen him. It became clear that no one had spoken to Wade following the past Friday. Apparently, Wade never made it back to his dorm that night. Realizing this, the police were contacted, and Wade was declared missing. The first step was to check Wade's phone records, and it was determined that Wade's phone must still be somewhere on the campus grounds. Since the tracking could only determine the rough area, a large search was launched to find Wade. The whole premise was searched, and even students on horseback checked out the nearby woods. Weeks of searching resulted in only one minor discovery: one of Wade's shoes that had been left in front of a door outside of Owen Hall. This door led to a maintenance room, and after searching it, Wade wasn't found. Without any new leads, the search was abandoned after about 1 month. It would take 2 more months for a new development to come up. A maintenance worker noticed a strange popping sound while patrolling the laundry rooms. While searching the area, he noticed that the noise was not coming from the laundry room. He follows the popping sound to the door right across from the laundry room and enters it. What this worker found inside this room solved the mystery of Wade's disappearance. Based on what police found inside the room, they reconstructed the evening Wade went missing and published this official version of the events. After being denied entry to Owen Hall, Wade had in fact not decided to give up and leave the area. He was still determined to somehow enter Owen Hall. He just needed another way. Wade believed to have found this way when he spotted a heavy maintenance door behind a metal railing. This door, located on the left side of the building, was the exact same spot where they later found his show. And even though there was no sign stating to keep out, it should have been obvious to anyone that this door was leading to a maintenance room. Moreover, the door was actually not on ground level, but at basement level, further indicating that this door was not intended for students to use. And since it wasn't intended for students, it was always locked. But this fateful evening, it wasn't locked. Due to his drunken stupor, Wade climbed over the metal railing and jumped down to the door. After more or less successfully landing there, he noticed that the door was unlocked and entered the maintenance room. Wade was determined to get inside Owen Hall, and now he had made it. Only that this door didn't lead to the dormitories. This is also where he left his shoe, tucking it in the door jamb of the heavy door. He most likely did this to both have a light source from outside and to avoid getting locked inside the room if the door would close. Despite that idea, the room was completely dark, and he only navigated through this darkness by listening to the sounds of nearby machines. Naturally, this tactic eventually led to him bumping into these machines. He felt the metal surface, felt the rhythmic humming, and heard the mechanical sounds. But since he only intended to traverse this room to get to the dorm, he opted to ignore the machine and just go around it. However, he did use this machine for orientation and basically clung to it, hoping that it would end near a door. But after a long walk through the darkness, he came face to face with a wall. Wade had underestimated the size of the machine and had no idea where he was. And this is when he made a fatal mistake. Wade noticed that there was a small space between the wall and the machine. Being drunk, he thought that it would be a great idea to squeeze himself through that narrow space. You basically have to imagine that he entered this space sideways, with his chest pressing against the machine and his hands in front of his face. Basically wedged between machine and a hard space, Wade tried to make his way through the narrow space. And this is when something happened that will eventually happen to any intoxicated person. He slipped. This accident forced him to grab onto the machine in front of him, and by sheer accident, one of his fingers actually went inside the machine. As it turns out, this maintenance room was an electrical vault containing 6 high-voltage transformers. Even if you have no knowledge about such machines, you can guess that quite a lot of high-voltage electricity is transformed inside these transformers. Of course, these transformers have a good isolation, and as Wade had demonstrated before, it was safe touching most of their surface. But one of Wade's fingers accidentally touched one of the few non-protected surfaces in such a machine. When his finger entered this 2-inch hole, the tip of his finger touched an exposed electrical conductor. As a result, 2,000 to 4,000 volts were transferred into his body and probably killed him instantly. But the most gruesome part was that Wade was still locked in between the machine and the wall, so his body remained right there. For 2 months, his corpse was continuously electrocuted by this transformer. However, when his body fluids began to leak out of his body, the situation changed. The now altered electrical current began to send small discharges into the ground. The popping sound heard by the worker was the sound of Wade Steffey's dead body transmitting electricity to the ground. When the worker finally entered the room, he didn't actually see Wade right away, but he definitely smelled him. This rotten stench led him to look around the transformer, and this is when he spotted Wade. This is also the reason the police hadn't found Wade during the search. After finding his shoe, they didn't actually enter the exterior door Wade had entered. Instead, they entered the electrical vault the same way this worker later did. As a result, they only saw an open room with no humans in sight, not realizing that a dead body was hidden behind one of the machines in a weird angle. Following this discovery, the university was blamed for Wade's death because the door was supposed to be locked at all times. His family was awarded $500,000 in damages, and Purdue University established a scholarship in Wade's name. This case is an eerie reminder how easy one's life can end. You don't need to enter a dangerous island or pick up radioactive metal to come face to face with death. Sometimes even the smallest act of trespassing can lead to a catastrophe.